Hello, everyone, and welcome to our podcast series in the classical political economy tradition by the Vinson Center for the Public Understanding of Economics and Entrepreneurship at the University of Buckingham. The Vinson Center runs a series of programs in economics and related fields designed to promote a wider understanding of classical liberal economics and how markets, trade, and entrepreneurship promote welfare in a free society. I am Juan Castañeda, Director of the Vinson Center, and today we'll be hosting Norbert Michel. Norbert Michel is Vice President and Director of the Cato Institute Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives. Norbert leads a team of scholars that develop original policy solutions to expand freedom through improving financial markets and monetary policy. He's also the author of the forthcoming book, Crushing Capitalism: How the Stagnation Narrative is Threatening the American Dream. Norbert was most recently the Director for Data Analysis at the Heritage Foundation. He was previously a professor at Nicholls State University's College of Business. Norbert holds a doctoral degree in financial economics. Today, we'll discuss the rise in populist economic policies in the US and elsewhere with Dr. Norbert Michel. In the last few years, in most advanced economies, we've seen a growing sentiment in favor of economic nationalism. If you like, a set of attitudes and policies usually labeled as economic populism. So definitions are important. So could you please start by just summarizing what they consist of? How would you define economic populism?
Sure. It's historically, there's always a component of sort of like the big guy against the little guy, the common man. So it's something big like Wall Street or big business is exploiting or harming the little guy or the common man, the common worker. And the politicians will come in and say, well, you know, what we need to do is protect the common man from whoever, the Wall Street guys, right? There's a long history of this in the United States. A lot of people don't even realize the Federal Reserve, it was basically created, you know, at least in large part, out of a populist movement against the big banks and the moneyed interest in Wall Street. So it always involves some political movement latching on to some perceived grievance from some group, some bigger group usually. And it's not always very well defined. Sometimes it has a foreign component, you know, like China right now, right? It's the Chinese or the Mexicans stealing our jobs, or the Mexicans ripping us off, or the Chinese ripping us off, whatever that might be. And that kind of just starts it going, right?
Well, what do you think explains the rise in this anti-free market sentiment in the US and elsewhere, to be fair? I mean, looking at the data available, for example, the real GDP per capita in the US is now 3 times higher than that in the mid-1970s. After 2 oil crises, the dot-com bubble, the global financial crisis, and the pandemic. So what explains this anti-market narrative?
I wish I had a great answer. It's hard to say. And I suspect that it's not one thing. I suspect that it is, at least in recent times, I think it is, because to go further back, right? No matter what happens, you have some group willing to push against the market stuff, right? So you see, and I think you saw a lot more of it in the United States, especially after the Great Depression and the New Deal. So that kind of like sets you up. That's kind of always there. That's been the big intellectual battle. But more recently, you're right. There's less of a reason to have this sort of sentiment, anti-market sentiment in the United States. But I think part of it, at least, is a group of intellectuals and political operatives sort of trying to explain or justify or exploit the Trump victory. So you have this guy, this outsider, come in, and he comes in and he wins the election in 2016. And you got to, if you want to exploit that and you want to perpetuate that, you've got to say why. And so part of it is, picking up some of the themes of the things that Trump would talk about, right? He would always talk about the anti-trade stuff, the anti-immigrant stuff, but it was always an underlying kind of thing. It was just there, right? He was really like, it was this weird, you couldn't really put your finger on it, this outsider sentiment. He's not the politician. He's not the establishment. So it's different. We're going to drain the swamp. All these different things that he would say, right? And the ones that took hold were the anti-immigrant sentiment and then and the anti-trade stuff. And I think that at least part of it, I think you have to have that as part of the explanation. But again, it's not new. And even after the beginning, even after the Reagan Revolution, right? Reagan got pummeled by the left, and then eventually some even on the right. Ross Perot, Pat Buchanan, Bill Clinton to a large extent. These were many of the same exact themes that you would hear over and over again. Even after the 80s boom, Pat Buchanan had a great run. Lyndon LaRouche was not as famous and not as successful as someone like Pat Buchanan, but also had a good run, doing the same thing. And I think, maybe to go a little bit deeper, humans always kind of have to have this thing to be struggling against. And, it makes sense when somebody tells us something like, oh yeah, it's those big guys over there you can't see. They're holding down the worker. It's just kind of like it's intuitive or some sort of innate thing that we have where we're like, oh yeah, that's not okay. And nobody stops to look at all the statistics. There's too many statistics. And then you can fight about the statistics.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, but the GDP is the statistic if you want to discuss, economic growth over the medium to long term.
Well, yeah, and then right now what's going on? It's a great example, though. You get people who misuse those statistics, and I don't want to attribute any ill motive to anyone in particular, but I mean it's pretty hard to not say that the people who are promoting the degrowth idea and the stagnation idea, it's pretty hard to say that they're not doing it on purpose and that they're not aware of what they're doing. They're cherry picking dates. They're cherry picking even with GDP, right? You can cherry pick dates and make the growth look a lot worse than it really is. You could say, like, you could start in 1947 instead of 1957 just because, and make the first half of the post-war GDP look great and the second half look really bad just by that date, just by doing that. So, and people know that, and they still do it. People who know better, who know exactly what they're doing, they still do that and try to make this case for we've gotten so terrible. Everything has gotten so terrible because of whether it's trade or immigration or automation, and they do things like that. Depending on how you make an adjustment for inflation, you can make things look a lot worse than they really are. And as over a very long period of time with just an index for inflation, I mean, it's really hard to describe how much better things really are. In 1970, you didn't have an iPhone. The car was a gas guzzler. You didn't go on vacation every year. You had hand-me-down clothes. You didn't, the family didn't jump in a plane and go everywhere they wanted to, 2-3 times a year. Like the cost of living was higher. The enjoyment that we had and the productivity that we had was lower. But if you just look at a price index, that doesn't really convey the information. You go to a grocery store in the 1970s in the typical U.S. town, even in a metro area, you didn't have every fruit from every country in the world all year round. Like that wasn't a thing. And the price index doesn't tell you that, right? So it's easy if somebody wants to exploit something like GDP. It's easy enough to do it, and I think unfortunately people do it. If you try to use sort of like a fixed position for the American middle class in the 1970s, it has gotten smaller, but it hasn't gotten smaller because they've gotten poorer. It's gotten smaller because they've gotten so much richer. And the share of American households earning over $100,000, it more than tripled since the 1970s. And the share earning under 35, if you sort of think of that as like a poverty line, it fell. It fell by over 25%. So there are still little guys, there, but the starting wage, and the typical wage for service jobs, which are much more plentiful than other types of jobs, is actually higher. And if you look at the low end of the distribution and how well they did over the last several decades, there are some bumps in the recession periods, but outside of that, they had some of the strongest growth, if not the strongest growth, throughout the income distribution. Those groups tended to have typically had more growth than even the higher income earning Americans did throughout most of that period. So, you can look out and say, well, there are high returns to a college education and there are not as high returns to somebody if you don't go to college. Well, okay, that's true. But you do have more people going to college than ever before. And you could also do this same sort of exercise over the last several decades, not the same 5. But if you look at the 80s, from the 80s on, even the people who, even males, the much maligned male worker who did not graduate from high school, actually had some of the highest wage growth in that group of any. In many parts of that period, even had higher wage growth than college earners and high school graduates. So, it's not the case that group or those lower income groups have just been decimated and shut out either. So nobody really wants to talk about that. And I'm not saying, and nobody is saying that it's great to be on the bottom 20%. That's not the point. The point is there has been a lot of income growth there too. And if you look at consumption standards, right, if we forget about the income part because there's maybe tricky stuff going on there, if we use consumption measures, I mean, a fixed poverty level is basically gone down, to under 3% from something like, I think it was close to 30 5 decades ago. So, I mean, it's a dramatic increase in prosperity.
So isn't it the case then that those who lose are very much concentrated in specific regions and industries?
Yes, that's right. No, that's true. For example, if a manufacturing facility in, say, Ohio, in one region of Ohio, which is the main employer in that town, if they shut down and they leave, that's bad, right? It is devastating. And a lot of people will move, a lot of people won't. But we do have a welfare system that encourages them to stay put more than it did prior to that. And we also, although the free market gets blamed for that too, we do have job assistance programs for people, specifically manufacturing and trade related job losses. So I mean that does happen. There's no doubt. And I think maybe that's one of those things, like one of those themes, at least that the Trump folks and the Vance folks have been able to tap into. Even though if you read Vance's book, that Hillbilly Elegy book, he kind of that's a different take on the whole thing, right? That's very different than where Vance is now. Vance kind of said, no, don't blame the free market in that book. But now he does. So, make of that what you will.
All right. Well, almost every day we hear governments of all parties, all political parties, claiming that they can effectively promote economic growth or even lead economic growth with active industrial policies. Mm-hmm. This is a view shared by and supported by many economists on both sides of the Atlantic. For example, Mariana Mazzucato has been pretty famous for this, holding this position. Can you
Mhm.
explain what these policies consist of, and if they are any successful in promoting growth?
Oh, well, um, so there are lots, right? If you look in the development context, there are lots of different things. If you look in the industrial policy context, uh, you hear things like protective tariffs. It's especially important, supposedly, right?
Hmm.
I'm not saying this is true, but it's especially important to protect the native industry in a small developing country. So they'll have higher tariffs or call for higher tariffs or tariff quotas. They'll want government subsidies for various industries, public-private partnerships in different industries. I think that's maybe the subsidies, public-private partnerships, public investment as well, whether that's in research and development or something else. Um, you'll hear sort of like a economic development bank or something like that, like a government investment bank kind of deal, like a Green New Deal bank. Um, those are, I think, I might have missed one, but I think those are some of the standard bearers, so to speak.
And do these policies, especially those in which the government they claim that they can direct investment, they can subsidize investment in key sectors in the economy,
Hmm.
uh, highly tech sectors, for example, strategic sectors in the economy. Do you
Hmm.
see any benefit in that? Because they claim that they can actually promote growth and
Right.
direct it towards, sustainability over the medium to long term.
Right. The, and the bulk of the evidence suggests that no, that doesn't work, especially in the development context. If you read any of the work by William Easterly, I think the original book I think he did was the Elusive Quest for Growth. That's an eye opener. And there are other books and there are other stories. If you look out across the Latin American world, you know, we've kind of gone through this whole thing where more and more and more of those kinds of policies were tried, and they've been rejected because they didn't work and they did lead to corruption and stagnation, and enriched the very well connected and the politicians, but not the common man, not the guy that it was supposed to help, not the people that it was supposed to pull out of poverty. That's kind of the common theme there, you know. Even to stay away from the pure communists and socialists, you still get that same result most of the time. Um, so it's definitely not a good idea. And you could go even less of a sort of socialist tinge, right? You could talk about Robert Reich, Clinton's labor secretary. You could talk about him in the 80s and Lester Thoreau, how they were promoting Japanese and German style industrial policy. They all wanted us to copy that. They wanted us to copy the MIDI in Japan. They wanted us to, if the idea was that if we would just invest in high tech industry here in the United States, we would be just like Japan and even better. And there would be all these spillover effects, just like in Japan. And what happened? Well, we didn't follow that path. And now the top five companies that make semiconductors are American, not Japanese. It like Japan's stuck in stagnant mode. That's stagnation, right? And if you go to Germany, what's happening? Well, all the young people are leaving because they don't like their job opportunities and they don't like the welfare state and they don't like the high taxes.
Hmm.
Like there are just I don't even know how many examples of this stuff not working the way they say it does, but it's a very, very appealing political pitch.
It is.
Um, and it's especially great if you're one of the politicians.
Well, let's move on now and discuss trade. Perhaps this is the
Hmm.
last big topic that I would like to discuss with you.
Okay.
Free trade seems to be the area where even self-proclaimed free marketeers, let alone economic populists, are more
Hmm.
reluctant to support fully. Well, that's my
Yeah.
experience, at least here in the UK and in Europe, I would say. The
Hmm.
benefits of free trade is something we teach and learn in our first year economic degrees.
Yep.
In the current era of trade wars and trade nationalism, shouldn't we just support the adoption of unilateral free trade, regardless of
Yep.
what our competitors do?
Yes. Yes. I mean, this is, Economically, it's the only thing that makes sense, right? If China wants to sell us a bunch of cheap stuff, well, great. Let's take it.
Mhm.
And if it makes us richer and it makes people want to invest in us even more, great. Let's do it. Like you're not losing by doing that.
Mhm.
The gap between the populist trade policy and what economists traditionally would teach is incredibly large. And I spent many years, as you know, at the Heritage Foundation before I was at Cato, and the trade policy folks were staunch free traders. So it's kind of bizarre to see whatever that is that they're doing over there now, where they're kind of sort of supporting all of this stuff, that Trump is doing. Um, Whether it's for strategic reasons or whatever it is that they're saying, I think they would probably argue that their principles haven't changed, and I guess if that's true, that's good. But it would have been the case back in the day at Heritage that the trade policy analysts would have been arguing for free trade agreements no matter what.
Yeah, this
That
is something.
that
Sorry, Norbert.
No, no, no. There's just that a trade deficit, for example, right? That's
Uh-huh.
nothing to worry about. This
Yeah.
is silly. That we would have made that argument. So I don't know. I don't know why. I can't explain what they're doing. I don't know. But economically speaking, no, it would be only the most fringe of an economist that would be arguing against free trade and just having the free trade agreement from the beginning.
But it is not. I agree entirely with you. But it hasn't. It's not that fringe anymore to hear
All of a
economists
sudden, right?
using trade policies as a political tool to use in
Right.
your favor,
Right.
which is quite novel to me. I mean, because again,
Yeah.
a few years ago with the Brexit negotiations, right after the Brexit vote, only a minority here in the UK we supported the adoption of unilateral free trade. We just open our borders to the rest of the world, and if Europe they want to shoot themselves in the foot, that's for them to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
it
Mm-hmm.
was a very 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 small minority. I can tell you that.
Really? Okay. Okay.
Yeah, that
So
was very.
so so it's sort of a global issue now,
I would say
I
so,
guess.
and it
Yeah.
started a few years ago.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
I
many
don't
years
know.
ago actually, but at least I can tell you about Brexit, the Brexit negotiation years. It,
Uh-huh.
it was
Uh-huh.
just a textbook example of what not to do, really,
Mm-hmm.
because
Mm-hmm.
again, it
Mm-hmm.
was trade obstacles and barriers used for a political motive, if you like,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
maybe neither party realized that they were just harming their own citizens in doing so.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
you know and we tried to make the case for it, and it was really really difficult. I mean,
Yeah.
the case against it, I mean.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I think just in general, I think economists are always having to argue, and especially if you're on the free market side, there's always some of that. So I don't know that I have a great explanation for it. Um, but there is always some of that. And then the more policy oriented folks that you get involved, then the more of that sort of practical exception type stuff you get. Like, oh yeah, free trade would be great, but and then they fill in the blank with whatever, they have there. So
Yeah.
I don't know.
So for anyone interested in these topics, apart from your latest book, Crushing Capitalism: How the Stagnation Narrative is Threatening the American Dream, which other authors or books would you recommend?
Well, I already said William Easterly,
Hmm.
but I highly recommend his stuff. And I had another book.
All right.
Um, we had a book called Financing Opportunity, and that one is sort of it sort of talks about the populist stuff, but just in financial markets.
Okay, perfect. So we'll be recommending both. Thank you,
Thank you,
Norbert,
thank you.
for your time and for joining us today. You've been very kind.
Oh no, thank you very much. I was happy to do it.